The wind cut through the Colorado mountains like a knife, carrying with it the smell of pine and coming snow. Jakob Nordstrom stood at the edge of his property, axe in hand, looking down at the valley below. From up here you could see for miles. Nothing but trees, rocks, and sky. That's how he liked it. Quiet. Alone. He brought the axe down hard, splitting another log clean in two. The pile beside him was already taller than a man. But winter was coming, and up here in the mountains you could never have too much firewood. 3 winters he'd spent in this place. 3 brutal, bone-chilling winters that tested every ounce of strength he had. Jakob was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick-armed from years of hard work. His face was weathered, carved with lines that made him look older than his 38 years. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who'd built everything he owned from scratch. He didn't talk much, never saw the point. Words didn't chop wood or fix roofs or keep you alive when the temperature dropped so low your breath froze in the air. He'd come to America from Norway 12 years ago with his parents and younger sister. They dreamed of land, of freedom, of building something that belonged to them, but dreams and reality were different things. His parents died that first winter, caught in a blizzard while trying to reach the nearest town for supplies. His sister married a merchant and moved to Denver. She begged Jakob to come with her to leave the mountains and find work in the city. But Jakob stayed. This land was bought with his family's dreams. He couldn't just walk away from it. The problem was a man couldn't run a homestead alone. Not really. There was too much work. Too much that needed doing. So 3 years ago, he'd done what many men in his situation did. He'd put out word that he was looking for a wife. A mail-order bride, they called it. A woman willing to travel west for the promise of marriage and a home. The first one lasted 2 weeks. Her name was Catherine, and she'd come from Boston. She took one look at the cabin, one look at the outhouse, one look at the work that needed doing, and she started crying. She cried for 3 days straight. On the 4th day, she demanded he take her back to town. Jakob did. He didn't argue. What was the point? The second one made it almost a month. Ingrid was her name, and she was Swedish. Jakob thought maybe someone from the old country would understand the kind of life he was trying to build. But Ingrid had come from Stockholm, a real city with real houses and real society. She tried, he'd give her that. But the isolation broke her. She'd stand at the window for hours, staring down the mountain like she was waiting for something to appear. Finally, she told him she felt like she was going crazy, like the mountains were closing in on her. He took her to town the next morning. The third one was named Helen, and she was different from the first 2. She was tough, practical, and she didn't complain about the work. But she couldn't stand Jakob himself. She said he was cold as the mountain ice, said living with him was like living with a ghost, said she'd rather die an old maid than spend another day with a man who barely spoke 10 words to her. That one stung more than he wanted to admit. She left after 6 weeks. After Helen, Jakob figured that was it. 3 tries, 3 failures. The men in town started calling his place the cursed cabin. They said no woman could last up there. Some joked that Jakob was too mean. Others said the land itself was wrong, that it didn't want to be tamed. Jakob stopped going to town except when he absolutely had to. He stopped talking to his neighbors. He threw himself into the work, into building and fixing and preparing for winter, trying to convince himself that he didn't need anyone. But the truth gnawed at him in the quiet moments. The truth was he was lonely, not in a way he could easily explain, but in a way that settled into his bones. He'd grown up in a house full of noise and laughter and people. Now days would go by where the only voice he heard was his own, talking to the animals. So when Pastor Jennings came riding up the mountain one afternoon in late September, Jakob was surprised. The pastor was an old man, white-haired and bent, but he still made the rounds to the isolated homesteads, checking on people. "Jakob," the pastor called out, climbing down from his horse with a grunt. "Got some news for you." Jakob set down the fence post he was carrying and walked over. "What kind of news?" The pastor pulled a letter from his coat pocket. "Another woman answered your advertisement. Been corresponding with her for a few months now. She's serious about coming out here." Jakob took the letter but didn't open it. "Pastor, I appreciate it, but I'm done with that. 3 times is enough. I'll manage on my own." "This one's different," the pastor said.
"Read the letter. Different how?"
Jakob asked, suspicious. "What's wrong with her?" The pastor hesitated. "Nothing's wrong with her exactly. But she's not like the others. She's from Philadelphia, been working in a garment factory. And she's sick, Jacob. Consumption, they call it, tuberculosis. The doctors told her she's got maybe 2 years. Jacob stared at the old man. And you think I should marry a dying woman? Why would you even tell her about this place? Because she has nowhere else to go, the pastor said quietly. No family, no money. She'll die in that factory, alone and forgotten unless someone gives her a chance. I told her the truth about this place. About the work, the isolation, the previous brides. And you know what she said? She said it sounded better than where she was. Jacob opened the letter. The handwriting was neat, careful. The words were simple and honest. She didn't make promises she couldn't keep. She didn't talk about love or romance. She just said she was willing to work, willing to learn, and willing to try. She asked for nothing except a chance. When's she coming? Jacob heard himself ask. Stage arrives Thursday, the pastor said. 3 days from now. You don't have to meet her if you don't want to. But I think you should. Jacob folded the letter and put it in his pocket. I'll think about it. But he already knew he'd be there. Not because he expected anything different this time. Not because he thought a sick woman from the city could handle mountain life, but because the pastor was right. If she had nowhere else to go, he understood that feeling. He'd felt that way himself after his parents died, after his sister left, after 3 women walked away from him. The next 3 days crawled by. Jacob found himself reading the letter over and over. Her name was Clara Whitmore. She was 28 years old. She wrote that she'd been an orphan, raised in an institution, and that she'd been working in factories since she was 12. She didn't complain about it. She didn't ask for pity. She just stated the facts, plain and simple. Thursday morning came cold and gray. Jacob hitched up his wagon and made the 2-hour journey down the mountain to Timber Creek, the nearest town. It wasn't much of a town, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a few other buildings. The stage came through twice a week, bringing mail and occasional passengers. A small crowd had gathered near the stage stop. People always showed up when the stage arrived. It was entertainment in a place where not much happened. Jacob recognized some of the faces. He saw the smirks, the whispers. They all knew why he was there. They were waiting to see the 4th bride, waiting to see how long this one would last. Jacob stood apart from the crowd, leaning against his wagon. He pulled his hat down low and tried to ignore the stares. The stage was late, which wasn't unusual. The roads were rough, and sometimes a wheel broke or a horse went lame. But every minute that passed made Jacob more tense. Part of him hoped she wouldn't come at all. It would be easier that way. Finally, someone shouted, "Stage coming!" Everyone turned to look down the road. Jacob saw the dust cloud first, then heard the thunder of hooves and the rattle of wheels. The stage came barreling into town, the driver pulling hard on the reins to slow the horses. It came to a stop in a cloud of dust and noise. The driver climbed down and opened the door. 2 men stepped out first, both traveling salesmen by the look of their fancy suits and sample cases. Then came a woman in a blue dress, probably someone's relative come to visit. Jacob waited, his hands shoved in his pockets, his jaw tight, and then she appeared. Clara Whitmore was small. That was the first thing Jacob noticed. Probably didn't weigh more than 100 pounds soaking wet. She wore a dark gray dress that had been mended multiple times and a thin shawl that wouldn't do anything against a mountain winter. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and there were dark circles under her eyes. Her hair was brown, pulled back in a simple bun. She carried one small bag, everything she owned in the world. She stepped down from the stage carefully, like her legs weren't quite steady. Then she coughed, a deep, rattling cough that made several people in the crowd step back. She covered her mouth with a handkerchief and waited for the coughing fit to pass. When she lowered the handkerchief, Jacob saw a spot of blood on the white cloth. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Good Lord, she looks half dead already." Clara heard it. Jacob saw her flinch, saw her shoulders tighten. But she didn't cry. She didn't turn around and get back on that stage. She just stood there looking around with quiet dignity, searching for someone. Jacob pushed off from his wagon and walked over. The crowd parted for him, everyone going quiet. He stopped a few feet from her and pulled off his hat. "Clara Whitmore?" She looked up at him. Her eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds. "Yes, you must be Jacob Nordstrom." Her voice was soft but steady. Jacob nodded. "I am." "That your only bag?" "It is." He picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. "Wagon's over there." It's a long ride up the mountain. You might want to rest a bit first. I'm fine, she said. Then she coughed again, harder this time. When she finished, she looked at him with those gray eyes and said, I'm fine. Let's go. Jakob led her to the wagon. He helped her up onto the seat, and she settled in without a word of complaint. The crowd watched them leave, and Jakob could feel their eyes on his back. He knew what they were thinking, betting on how long she'd last. Days, not weeks, they were probably saying. They rode in silence for the first hour. The road wound up through the mountains, getting steeper and rougher. The wagon jolted over rocks and ruts. Clara gripped the side of the seat but didn't say anything. Jakob glanced at her a few times. Her face was set, determined, but he could see how weak she was. Every bump seemed to jar her bones. Finally, as they climbed higher and the air got colder, he said, You should know what you're getting into. The cabin's rough. No luxuries. Lot of work. And winter's coming. Clara nodded. Pastor Jennings told me. Then you know 3 other women couldn't handle it. They all left. She looked at him then, really looked at him. I'm not them. You're sick, Jacob said bluntly. Mountain winters are hard. Might make it worse. Might make it better, Clara said. The doctor said I need clean air and rest. Can't get either in a factory. There's not much rest in running a homestead. There's different kinds of hard, Clara said quietly. I've been working since I could walk. I'm not afraid of work. What I'm afraid of is dying alone in a city where nobody knows my name. Jakob didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They rode on. The sun was getting low when they finally reached his property. Jakob pointed to a break in the trees. Through there. The cabin came into view, and Jakob saw it through her eyes. It was small, maybe 20 feet on each side. The logs were rough and weathered. The roof sagged a little on one side. Smoke came from the stone chimney. There was a barn, a chicken coop, and a small shed. Beyond that, nothing but wilderness. Jakob stopped the wagon and climbed down. He helped Clara down, and she stood there looking at the cabin. He waited for it, the moment when she'd realize what she'd gotten herself into, the moment when she'd ask to go back. Instead, Clara picked up her bag and walked toward the cabin door. She stopped at the threshold and turned back to look at him. Are you coming? Jakob blinked. Then he followed her inside, wondering if maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. The inside of the cabin was dim, lit only by the fire in the stone hearth and the fading daylight coming through 2 small windows. Clara stood just inside the doorway, her bag still in her hand, taking it all in. Jakob watched her face, waiting for the disappointment he'd seen 3 times before. The cabin was 1 room. A rope bed stood in the corner with a thin mattress and a couple of wool blankets. There was a table made from split logs, 2 chairs that didn't quite match, and a shelf holding tin plates, cups, and a few supplies. The floor was packed dirt, swept clean but still dirt. A cook stove sat near the fireplace, its surface dusty from disuse. Tools hung on the walls alongside a rifle and some traps. Everything was functional, nothing was pretty. Clara set down her bag. She walked slowly around the room, running her hand along the table, examining the shelf, looking up at the ceiling where you could see the underside of the roof boards. Jakob noticed a small leak stain in one corner. He'd been meaning to fix that. Solid, Clara finally said. Good bones. Jakob wasn't sure he'd heard her right. What? The cabin, she said, turning to look at him. It's well built. The walls are tight. The fireplace draws properly. I can see that. It's not much, Jakob said, feeling the need to be honest. No proper floor. Roof leaks a little. The stove needs cleaning. I don't cook much, mostly just make coffee and heat up whatever I hunt or store. Clara nodded. She walked to the stove and opened it, peering inside. Then she closed it and turned back to him. Where do you sleep? Jakob felt his face get hot. He hadn't thought this part through. With the other brides, there'd been an awkward conversation, some arrangement made. Catherine had demanded he sleep in the barn. Ingrid had insisted on hanging a blanket to divide the room. Helen had told him they'd figure it out after they got to know each other, but they never did. I'll sleep in the barn, he said quickly. You take the bed. I've got blankets out there. Clara studied him for a moment. That's not practical. Winter's coming, you said so yourself. You'll freeze in the barn. I'll manage. We're both adults, Clara said simply. We'll figure something out that makes sense. But for now, you should stay where you've been staying. I can make do. Before Jakob could argue, she started coughing again. This time it was worse, her whole body shaking with it. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself, and Jakob moved forward instinctively, reaching out to help. But Clara held up one hand, stopping him, while she covered her mouth with the other. The coughing went on for almost a minute. When it finally stopped, she was pale and sweating, leaning heavily on the table. "You need to rest," Jakob said. "I'll get some water." He went outside to the pump and filled a bucket with cold water. When he came back in, Clara was sitting in one of the chairs, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. He poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. She drank slowly, carefully, like even swallowing was work. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jacob busied himself building up the fire. He didn't know what else to do. He'd never been good at taking care of sick people. When his mother had fallen ill on the ship coming to America, his father had handled everything. Jacob had just felt helpless standing there watching. "I've got some dried venison and beans," he said, his back to her. "I can make something to eat." "I can do it," Clara said. "It's my job now. You just got here." "You're tired." "I'm always tired," Clara said, and there was something in her voice that made Jacob turn around. She was looking at him with those gray eyes, and for a moment he saw past the sickness, past the frailty, to something hard and determined underneath. "I didn't come here to be taken care of. I came here to work. So let me work." Jakob didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and stepped aside. Clara stood up slowly and walked to the shelf. She examined what was there, then looked at the stove. Without asking, she began cleaning it out, scraping away the buildup, wiping down the surface. Her movements were careful but efficient, like someone who'd done this kind of work 1,000 times before. She soaked the beans in water while she worked on the stove. Then she got a fire going in it and set a pot on top. Jakob watched her move around the small space, organizing, cleaning, making sense of things. She didn't talk while she worked. Neither did he. The silence between them wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was just quiet. By the time the beans were cooked and the venison heated through, full darkness had fallen outside. They ate at the table, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin plates and the crackle of the fire. The food was simple, but Clara had added some dried herbs she'd found on the shelf, and it tasted better than anything Jakob had made for himself in months. "Where did you learn to cook?" he asked. "The orphanage," Clara said. "They put us to work as soon as we were old enough. Kitchen duty, laundry, cleaning. Then when I went to the factory, I had to cook for myself in a boarding house. You learn quick when you're hungry." "What kind of factory?" "Garment factory. Making shirts mostly. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The air was full of cotton dust and lint. That's probably what made me sick, breathing that in day after day." She said it matter-of-factly, without bitterness. Just stating a fact. Jacob thought about 12-hour days in a hot, dusty factory and compared it to his life up here. Different kinds of hard, she'd said earlier. He was starting to understand what she meant. After dinner, Clara insisted on cleaning up. Jakob went outside to check on the animals and give her some privacy. The night air was cold, sharp in his lungs. Stars filled the sky, more stars than you could ever count. He stood there for a while, listening to the wind in the trees, trying to make sense of what he was feeling. He'd expected another Catherine or another Helen. Someone who'd take one look at this life and want to leave. But Clara was different. She didn't complain. She didn't cry. She just quietly went about doing what needed to be done. It made him uneasy in a way he couldn't explain, like she was already accepting something he hadn't even offered yet. When he came back inside, Clara had hung a rope across one corner of the cabin and draped a blanket over it, creating a small, private space. She was already behind it. Jakob saw her shadow moving in the firelight as she changed into a nightgown. "I'll sleep on this side," she called out. "You take the bed. You're bigger and you need the rest. You've got more work to do than I do." "That's not right," Jakob started to argue. "It makes sense," Clara said firmly. "I'll be fine with some blankets on the floor. I've slept on worse." Jakob wanted to argue more, but he was too tired. And honestly, the thought of sleeping in the barn wasn't appealing with the temperature dropping like it was. So he pulled off his boots and lay down on the bed, still wearing his clothes. The rope and blanket barrier between them felt both inadequate and necessary. He listened to Clara settle down on her side of the blanket. He heard her cough, softer this time, probably trying to muffle it. Then silence. Jakob stared at the ceiling. at the shadows cast by the dying fire, and wondered how long she'd last. Days, weeks. Part of him hoped she'd leave soon, before he got used to having her here. Another part of him hoped she'd stay, at least through the winter, at least long enough to not die alone. The next morning came cold and gray. Jakob woke before dawn like he always did, and lay there for a moment, remembering he wasn't alone. He heard movement on the other side of the blanket. Clara was already up. When he emerged from the bed, she'd already folded up her blankets and was working on getting the fire going again. She changed back into her gray dress. In the morning light, she looked even more fragile than she had yesterday. Her wrists were thin as bird bones. Her face was hollow, but her jaw was set and her hands were steady as she added wood to the fire. "Morning," Jacob said. "Good morning," Clara replied. "Coffee? I'll make it. I can do it." They stood there looking at each other, and Jakob saw the stubbornness in her eyes. She wasn't going to back down. "Fine," he said. "I'll be outside doing the morning chores." He left her to it and went to tend the animals. He had 3 cows, a dozen chickens, 2 pigs, and a horse. Feeding them, milking, collecting eggs, all the daily tasks that had to be done no matter what. When he came back inside with a bucket of fresh milk and a basket of eggs, Clara had coffee ready and was frying eggs on the stove. They ate breakfast in the same silence as dinner. Then Clara asked, "What needs doing today?" Jakob thought about it. There was always work. Too much work for one person. "I need to finish cutting firewood. Need to check the roof before the snow comes. Need to bring in more supplies from the shed. What can I do?" Jakob looked at her doubtfully. "You should rest." "I rested all night," Clara said. "What can I do?" He thought about giving her something easy, something inside. But he remembered what she'd said about being afraid of dying alone in a city where nobody knew her name. She'd come here to live, not to sit around waiting to die. "There's mending that needs doing," he said. "My clothes are all falling apart, and the blankets have holes. If you're any good with a needle, that would help. I can do that." So that's how they spent their first full day. Jakob outside splitting wood and checking the roof, while Clara inside mended his shirts, his pants, his socks, everything that had torn or worn through. He'd come in periodically to check on her, and each time she'd be sitting by the window for the light, needle moving steadily through fabric. She didn't complain. She didn't stop. She just worked. Days turned into a week, then 2 weeks. Jakob waited for Clara to break, to give up, to demand he take her back to town. But she didn't. She just kept working, kept contributing, kept making herself useful. She organized the cabin properly for the first time since Jakob had built it. She found places for things, made it more efficient. She started cooking real meals instead of the slapped-together food Jakob had been surviving on. But the work was taking its toll. Jakob could see it. Clara's coughing was getting worse. Some days she could barely get through a sentence without stopping to catch her breath. Her face got paler, her body thinner. She moved slower, more carefully, like she was rationing her energy. One afternoon, Jakob came in from working on the barn roof to find Clara on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor. She was coughing so hard she couldn't stop. He dropped his tools and went to her, putting a hand on her back. "That's enough," he said firmly. "You need to rest." "Not done yet," Clara gasped between coughs. "I don't care. You're going to make yourself worse." She looked up at him and he saw tears in her eyes. Not from sadness, just from the strain of coughing so hard. "If I stop working, what use am I? Why would you keep me here if I can't earn my place?" The question hit Jakob like a punch to the gut. "That's not how this works." "That's how everything works," Clara said. "In the orphanage, if you couldn't work, they sent you away. At the factory, if you couldn't keep up, they fired you. I need to be useful. I need to earn this." Jakob helped her to her feet and guided her to a chair. "Listen to me. You're not at the orphanage or the factory anymore. Nobody's going to send you away because you're sick. Nobody's going to fire you because you need to rest. Then why am I here?" Clara asked, and the question was genuine, not challenging. "Why would you let me stay?" Jakob didn't have a good answer for that. He didn't know why he was letting her stay. Maybe because she was trying so hard. Maybe because she reminded him of himself, stubborn and alone. Maybe because having someone else in the cabin, even someone sick, was better than being completely alone. "Because you're here," he finally said. "That's reason enough." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "Okay." That night, Jakob woke to the sound of Clara coughing. It was violent, desperate coughing that seemed to tear through her. He lay there listening, wanting to help but not knowing how. Finally, he got up and went to her side of the blanket. "Clara?" "I'm fine," she gasped. "Go back to bed." "You're not fine." He brought her water and she drank it in small sips. When the coughing finally subsided, she was shaking all over. Without thinking, Jakob grabbed an extra blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You need to see a doctor," he said. "No point. They already told me what's wrong. Can't be fixed. There has to be something they can do." Clara shook her head. "Some things can't be fixed, Jakob. You just live with them as long as you can." She said his name. It was the first time she'd used it, and something about hearing it in her quiet, steady voice made his chest tighten. He sat there on the floor next to her, the blanket still around her shoulders, neither of them speaking. After a while, Clara said, "The other women who were here, why did they really leave?" Jakob thought about lying, but what was the point? Catherine said the work was too hard. Ingrid said the isolation was too much. Helen said I was too cold, too distant. Were they right? Probably, Jakob admitted. I don't talk much. Never have. And this life is hard. Isolation is real. Maybe I'm not cut out for having anyone here. Maybe they weren't cut out for being here, Clara said. That doesn't mean you were wrong. Jakob looked at her, surprised. You defending me? I'm stating facts, Clara said. Not everyone can live like this. That's not a fault in them or in you. It just is what it is. The first snow came 2 days later. Jakob woke to find the ground covered in white and more falling from a gray sky. Winter had arrived early. He looked over at the blanket partition and saw that Clara was still asleep. She'd been sleeping more lately, her body needing the rest. He went outside and stood in the falling snow. 3 more months until spring, maybe 4. He looked back at the cabin and thought about the woman inside. She'd been here almost a month now, longer than Helen, almost as long as Ingrid, and she showed no signs of leaving. But winter on the mountain was brutal. If Clara's health got worse, if she got too sick, he'd have to take her down to town to a doctor. The roads would be nearly impassable once the heavy snows came. He felt a weight settle on his chest, the weight of responsibility of having someone else's life depending on him. When he went back inside, Clara was up, making coffee. She looked out the window at the snow and smiled, just a small smile, but genuine. First snow, she said. It's beautiful, Jakob grunted. It's the start of the hard season. I know, Clara said. She poured him a cup of coffee and handed it to him. But it's still beautiful, and standing there in the small cabin watching the snow fall, drinking coffee that someone else had made for him, Jakob had to admit that maybe she was right. Maybe it was possible for something to be both hard and beautiful at the same time. He just hoped she'd live long enough to see the spring. Winter came down on the mountain like a hammer. The first snow was followed by another, then another. Within 2 weeks, there was 3 feet of white covering everything. The temperature dropped so low that water froze in the bucket overnight, even inside the cabin. Jakob had to break ice off the pump every morning just to get water for drinking and cooking. Clara's coughing got worse in the cold. Some mornings Jakob would wake to hear her behind the blanket partition, struggling to breathe, fighting to stop the coughing fits that racked her thin body. He'd pretend to still be asleep, giving her privacy. But inside he felt helpless. What could he do? He couldn't make her better. He couldn't stop the cold from seeping through the walls. All he could do was keep the fire burning and hope that was enough. But Clara never complained. That was the thing that amazed Jakob most. She'd drag herself out of bed, wrap a shawl around her shoulders, and start her day like nothing was wrong. She'd make coffee, cook breakfast, tend to whatever work needed doing inside the cabin. Some days she moved so slowly that Jakob wanted to tell her to go back to bed. But he'd learned that arguing with Clara was pointless. She'd just give him that steady look and keep doing what she was doing. One particularly cold morning, about 6 weeks after Clara's arrival, Jakob came in from feeding the animals to find her sitting at the table with one of his old coats spread out in front of her. She'd taken it completely apart, all the seams opened, the pieces laid out flat. What are you doing? He asked. Making it warmer, Clara said. She showed him some scraps of wool she'd found in a trunk. I'm going to line it with this. Double the fabric. It'll keep you warmer when you're working outside. You don't need to do that. I know I don't need to. I want to. She started stitching the wool pieces together. You're out there in the cold for hours every day. The least I can do is make sure you don't freeze. Jakob watched her work. Her fingers were red and swollen from the cold, but they moved steadily, creating neat, even stitches. Where'd you learn to sew like that? The factory, Clara said. I was good at it too. One of the fastest workers on my line. Not that it mattered much. They paid us all the same, whether you were fast or slow. Why'd you stay there if the pay was bad? Clara glanced up at him. Where else was I going to go? No family, no education beyond basic reading and writing. Factory work was what I could get. So I did it. She went back to her stitching. Besides, being good at something matters even if nobody else notices. You know what you can do. That counts for something. Jacob thought about that. He'd been good at building things, at working with wood and stone. That's why this cabin stood solid while others fell apart in the wind. Nobody had ever praised him for it. But he knew. And Clara was right, that did count for something. A few days later, Jacob was outside trying to fix a broken section of fence when he heard a strange sound from inside the cabin. A crash, then silence. He dropped his tools and ran inside. Clara was on the floor near the stove, unconscious. A pot of water had spilled, spreading across the dirt floor. Jakob's heart jumped into his throat. He rushed to her side, lifting her up. She was burning with fever, her skin hot to the touch even in the cold cabin. Clara, he said, patting her face gently. Clara, wake up. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. I'm sorry, she mumbled. I just got dizzy. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're burning up. Jacob carried her to the bed, the real bed, and laid her down. He covered her with every blanket he had. Then he went outside and packed snow into a bucket, brought it in to melt, and used the cold water to make compresses for her forehead. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes talking to people who weren't there, sometimes just staring at the ceiling. For 3 days, Jacob barely left her side. He forced her to drink water and broth. He kept the fire roaring, keeping the cabin as warm as possible. He changed the compresses when they got too warm. And he prayed, something he hadn't done since his parents died. He didn't know if anyone was listening, but he prayed anyway. On the 3rd night, Clara's fever broke. Jacob was dozing in a chair beside the bed when he felt her hand on his arm. He jerked awake to find her looking at him, her eyes clear for the first time in days. You should sleep properly, she said, her voice weak but steady. You're awake, Jacob said, relief flooding through him. How long was I out? 3 days, Clara closed her eyes. I'm sorry. You must have work to do. The work can wait, Jacob said. He meant it too. For 3 days he'd barely thought about the animals or the fences or any of it. All he'd cared about was keeping Clara alive. That's not practical, Clara said, but she didn't argue further. She was too weak. Over the next week, Clara slowly recovered her strength. Jacob made her stay in bed, bringing her meals, keeping her warm. He found himself talking more than he usually did, telling her about the land, about building the cabin, about his family. Clara listened quietly, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just letting him talk. One evening, as snow fell heavy outside, Jacob was checking the fire when Clara spoke from the bed. Tell me about your parents. Jacob stiffened. He never talked about them. Not to anyone. But Clara had almost died. She'd been in his bed fighting fever while he tried to keep her alive. Something about that changed things. They were good people, he finally said. My father was a carpenter in Norway. My mother made the best bread you ever tasted. They wanted a better life, so we came to America. What happened? Jacob stared into the fire. First winter here. They went to town for supplies. A blizzard came up sudden. They got lost. By the time someone found them, it was too late. He paused. I told them not to go. Said we had enough to last. But my father was worried about my sister. She needed medicine. So they went. You blame yourself, Clara said softly. I should have gone instead of them. Then you'd be dead and they'd be blaming themselves. Clara shifted in the bed. Loss isn't about whose fault it was. It just is, like being sick, like being alone. Sometimes things just are, and all you can do is keep living. Jacob turned to look at her. Is that what you're doing? Just keeping living? What else is there? Clara asked. I'm going to die, Jacob. Maybe this year, maybe next. That's decided. But how I live until then, that's up to me. I can spend my time feeling sorry for myself, or I can spend it doing something useful. Being somewhere that feels like it matters. And this place matters to you? Clara looked around the simple cabin. More than anywhere else I've ever been. Jacob didn't know what to say to that. so he just nodded and went back to tending the fire, feeling something shift inside his chest. By December, the snow was so deep that Jakob couldn't see the fence posts anymore. They were completely snowed in, cut off from the rest of the world. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, but it might as well have been 300. Nobody would be coming up the mountain until spring. Clara was back on her feet, but Jakob noticed she was more careful now. She paced herself, resting when she needed to, not pushing past her limits like she had before. She'd learned that up here, there was no doctor to run to if she collapsed again. One morning, Jakob woke to find Clara standing by the window looking out at the white landscape. The sun had come out for the first time in days, making the snow sparkle like diamonds. "I never saw anything like this in Philadelphia," she said. "This much snow. This much quiet." Jakob came to stand beside her. "You miss the city?" "No," Clara said without hesitation. "I don't miss the noise, the crowds, the smoke. I don't miss watching the sun come up through factory windows knowing I had another 12 hours ahead of me." She glanced at him. "Do you ever wish you'd stayed in the city? Lived a normal life?" "This is normal for me," Jakob said. "I don't know how to live any other way." "Me neither," Clara said. "I think that's why I'm still here. The other women, they knew a different way. They had something to compare this to. I don't. This is just life." That afternoon, while Jakob was in the barn checking on the cows, one of them went into labor. The birth was difficult, the calf coming wrong. Jakob worked for over an hour, his arms aching, trying to turn the calf, trying to save both mother and baby. Finally, the calf came free, but it wasn't breathing. Jakob grabbed a handful of straw and rubbed the calf's sides, trying to stimulate it. Nothing. He rubbed harder, getting desperate. The mother cow was lowing, trying to get to her baby. Jakob kept rubbing, kept working, even though he knew it was probably too late. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Clara had come out to the barn, wrapped in his old coat that she'd lined with wool. Without a word, she knelt beside the calf and helped him, rubbing its other side, working its legs. They worked together in silence, their breath fogging in the cold barn air. And then the calf gasped. Its chest heaved and it took a breath. Then another. Jakob sat back on his heels, shocked. The calf was breathing. "It was alive. You did it," Clara said, smiling. It was the first real smile Jakob had seen on her face since she'd arrived. It transformed her, made her look younger, less tired. "We did it," Jakob corrected. They stayed in the barn for another hour, making sure the calf was stable, making sure the mother was okay. Clara didn't complain about the cold, even though Jakob could see she was shivering. She just helped with whatever needed doing, handing him things, talking softly to the mother cow, being useful in that quiet way she had. That night they sat by the fire later than usual. Jakob was working on carving a new handle for a tool. Clara was mending another shirt. The silence between them had become comfortable over the past weeks, not awkward or heavy, just quiet. "Jakob," Clara said suddenly, "can I ask you something?" "Sure. Why did you really let me come here?" "You knew I was sick. You knew I probably wouldn't last. Why not just tell the pastor no?" Jakob set down his carving. He'd been asking himself the same question. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because the pastor said you had nowhere else to go. Maybe because I know what that feels like." He paused. "Or maybe because I was tired of being alone." "Are you still alone?" Clara asked quietly. Jakob looked at her across the firelight. She was watching him with those gray eyes, waiting for his answer. And he realized that no, he wasn't alone anymore. Somewhere between the day she'd arrived and now, between the silence and the work and the simple act of living in the same space, Clara had become real to him. Not just a sick woman he was helping. Not just another bride who'd probably leave. A real person. Someone he'd miss if she was gone. "No," he said. "I'm not alone anymore." Clara nodded, something like relief crossing her face. "Good. Neither am I." The next morning brought another snowstorm, this one fierce enough to shake the cabin walls. Jakob and Clara stayed inside, unable to do anything but keep the fire going and wait it out. The storm lasted 5 days. 5 days trapped in the small cabin together, the wind howling outside, the snow piling higher and higher. On the 3rd day, Clara asked Jakob to teach her to play chess. He'd carved a set years ago from wood scraps but hadn't played since his father died. They set up the board on the table between them and Jakob taught her the moves. Clara was a quick learner, strategic and patient. They played game after game, talking between moves about nothing important and everything important. Jacob told her about building the cabin, about every mistake he'd made, every problem he'd solved. Clara told him about the orphanage, about the other children she'd grown up with, about learning to survive in a place where nobody cared if you lived or died. I had a friend there, Clara said, moving her night. Her name was Ruth. She was younger than me, skinny little thing, always getting sick. I used to share my food with her, give her my blanket when it was cold. One winter, she got pneumonia. She died 3 days before Christmas. I'm sorry, Jacob said. I used to think about her a lot, Clara continued. Wonder why she died and I didn't. We were both sick. We both had nothing. But she died and I kept living. She looked up at him. I think I understand now. We keep living until we can't anymore. And while we're living, we try to make it mean something. Does this mean something? Jacob asked. Being here? Yes, Clara said simply. More than anything else in my life. The storm finally broke on the 5th day. Jacob went outside to dig out the door and check on the animals. Everything was buried under snow. The world transformed into nothing but white. When he looked back at the cabin, he saw smoke rising from the chimney, saw the warm light from the windows, and for the first time in years, the place looked like a home instead of just a structure. Inside, Clara was making coffee, moving around the kitchen area like she'd always been there. Jacob stomped the snow off his boots and came in, closing the door against the cold. Cows okay? Clara asked. They're fine. Calf's getting stronger every day. Clara handed him a cup of coffee. Their hands touched for just a moment, and Jacob felt something pass between them. Not romance exactly. Nothing like what the mail-order bride arrangement was supposed to create. But something else. Understanding, maybe. Partnership. The recognition that they were both survivors, both fighters, both people who'd learned to keep going when everything said they should give up. Clara, he said, thank you for staying. She looked at him, surprised. Where else would I go? I mean it. Thank you. Clara's expression softened. You're welcome, Jacob. Outside, the sun came out, brilliant against the white snow. Winter was only halfway done. There would be more storms, more cold nights. More days when Clara's cough got so bad Jacob worried she wouldn't make it. But standing there in the warm cabin, drinking coffee with someone who understood what it meant to survive, Jacob thought that maybe they'd make it through. Maybe for the first time since his parents died, he wouldn't have to face the winter alone. Spring came slowly to the mountains. In late February, the days started getting longer, the sun climbing a little higher in the sky. The snow began to melt, first in small patches, then in larger ones. Water ran down the mountain in streams, making everything muddy and difficult. But it was warm water, spring water, and it meant winter was finally loosening its grip. Clara had survived. That fact amazed Jacob every morning when he woke up and saw her already moving around the cabin, making coffee, starting her day. The doctors had given her 2 years and she'd already been sick for months before coming here. By their reckoning, she should be getting worse. But she wasn't. If anything, she seemed stronger. Her coughing fits were less frequent. Her face had more color. She moved with more energy. Jacob didn't want to say anything, didn't want to jinx it, but he couldn't help noticing. Something about the mountain air or the work or just having a reason to keep going was helping her. One morning in early March, Clara did something she hadn't done since arriving. She went outside and just stood there, face turned up to the sun, breathing deep. Jacob watched from where he was repairing the fence. He saw her close her eyes, saw a smile cross her face, small but genuine. First warm day in months, she called over to him. Still cold in the shade, Jacob warned. I don't care. It's warm enough. She walked over to where he was working. What are you doing? Fixing the fence. Winter always tears it up. He showed her where the posts had shifted in the frozen ground. Have to reset them or the animals will get out. Can I help? Jacob looked at her doubtfully. It's heavy work. I can hold things. Hand you tools. Something. So Clara helped him, doing what she could, learning as she went. She asked questions about the work, about the property, about his plans for spring. They talked more than they had all winter, the warming weather loosening something in both of them. That afternoon, Jacob made a decision. I'm going to town tomorrow. Need supplies. You want to come? Clara looked surprised. You trust me to make the trip? You made it through winter. Think you can handle a wagon ride down the mountain? The next morning, they set out early. The road was muddy but passable. Jakob drove carefully, avoiding the worst ruts and puddles. Clara sat beside him, bundled in the wool-lined coat she'd made for him. He'd insisted she wear it. She'd argued. He'd won. It took 3 hours to reach Timber Creek. When they arrived, people stopped and stared. Jakob could see the surprise on their faces, the whispered conversation starting up. The fourth bride hadn't just survived winter, she was still here, riding into town beside him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Jakob helped Clara down from the wagon. "You okay?" "I'm fine," she said. But he noticed her gripping his arm for support. The trip had tired her more than she wanted to admit. They went to the general store first. The owner, a man named Peterson, looked like he'd seen a ghost when they walked in. "Jakob and Mrs. Nordstrom, I presume." "Miss Whitmore," Clara corrected quietly. "We're not married." Peterson's eyebrows shot up, but he was smart enough not to comment. "What can I get for you folks?" Jakob gave him the supply list. While Peterson gathered things, Clara wandered the store looking at fabric, at seeds for planting, at things they couldn't afford, but that made her eyes light up anyway. Jakob watched her touch a piece of blue calico, her expression wistful. When Peterson wasn't looking, Jakob added the fabric to their order. Outside, they ran into Pastor Jennings. The old man's face broke into a huge smile when he saw them. "Clara, my dear girl, you're still here. You survived the winter." "I did," Clara said. "How are you feeling?" "Your health?" "Better," Clara admitted. "The cough isn't as bad as it was." The pastor looked at Jakob, then back at Clara. "The mountain air agrees with you." "Something does," Clara said softly. The pastor invited them to Sunday service, but Jakob declined. It was too far to come down the mountain every week, and Clara wasn't strong enough for that much travel. The pastor understood. Before they left, he pulled Jakob aside. "You did a good thing taking her in," the pastor said. "She's a fine woman. I hope you know that." "I know," Jakob said. "Are you planning to marry her properly? Make it official?" Jakob shifted uncomfortably. "Haven't discussed it." "Maybe you should," the pastor said gently. "She deserves to know where she stands, and you deserve to stop living like you're waiting for her to leave." The ride back up the mountain was quiet. Jakob couldn't stop thinking about what the pastor had said. The truth was, he hadn't thought about marriage. Not real marriage. The arrangement had been about convenience, about having help on the homestead. But somewhere along the way, it had become something else. He cared about Clara, actually cared, not just felt responsible for her. The thought of her leaving, of the cabin being empty again, made his chest tight. But Clara was sick. She could still die, probably would die sooner than someone her age should. Was it right to marry someone knowing you'd lose them? Was it fair to either of them? When they got back to the cabin, Jakob unloaded the supplies while Clara went inside to rest. The trip had exhausted her. He could see it in the way she moved, in the way she had to sit down the moment they arrived. But she was smiling. She'd enjoyed going to town, seeing people, being part of the world again. That evening, Jakob gave her the blue calico fabric. Clara stared at it, then at him. "You bought this?" "Saw you looking at it." "Jakob, we can't afford things like this, already bought it. Might as well use it." Clara held the fabric, running her hands over it. Her eyes were bright, maybe with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Over the next few days, Clara sewed herself a new dress from the blue fabric. Jakob would see her working on it in the evening light, her needle flashing, her expression peaceful. When she finally finished it and put it on, Jakob couldn't speak for a moment. She looked beautiful. Not just pretty, but alive in a way he hadn't seen before. "It fits," Clara said, turning to show him. "It's good," Jakob managed. "Looks good." April arrived, bringing warmer days and the first green shoots pushing up through the mud. Clara started a garden, planting seeds they'd bought in town. She worked the soil,